Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome very much to the British Academy in this very special event. My name's Paul Collins. I'm the current chair of trustees of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you here today for what will inevitably be an extraordinary talk, covering an area which, in fact, of course, is a familiar area for the British Institute. Many of you will remember back in 2019 that the Institute organized, in collaboration with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the University of Chicago, and the Department of History, Religions and Philosophies at SOAS, an extraordinary conference called the Jews of Iraq, Engagement with Modernities. That was way back in September 2019. And at that time, the conference explored the many contributions that the Jewish community in Iraq had in the early modern and modern period, covering the arts, culture, social policy, education, government, and the economy. And this afternoon, we are going to hear another example of that extraordinary contribution from the Jewish community in Iraq. Our talk today is given by a distinguished scholar, Professor Joseph Sassoon, who'll be talking about the influential Baghdadi Jewish trading family that shaped today's globalization. That's quite an extraordinary claim, as we'll hear is true. Professor Sassoon is the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and professor of history and political economy at Georgetown University. He holds the al-Sabah chair in politics and political economy of the Arab world. He is also a senior associate member at St. Antony's College, Oxford. He's published extensively on Iraq and its economy, on the Middle East in general. His books include The Economic Policy in Iraq, 1932 to 1950, The Iraqi Refugees, The New Crisis in the Middle East, and his 2013 book on Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, Inside an Authoritarian Regime by Cambridge University Press, won the prestigious British-Kuwait Prize for the best book on the Middle East. So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Professor Sassoon to the Academy and invite him to talk on the global merchants, the enterprise and extravagance of the Sassoon dynasty. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you to the British Academy and to its sponsors for having me here. Usually, family dynasties tends to be the story of rags to riches. But actually here we have a different story. It actually starts with riches in Baghdad, then to rags, then to riches, then to decline. It is essentially the history of what it means to be a refugee Jewish family, what it means to be wanting to be accepted so much, first in India and then in Britain, and why it was so important for them to be accepted in these places. The story actually begins a long time ago, almost 2,500 years in Baghdad, where there was basically a Jewish population going back to that period. And of course, by the 19th century, Baghdad was a province of the Ottoman Empire. Each province has its own governor and its own what is called Sarraf Bashi, tax collector, but in essence, in today's jargon, almost minister of finance. Each one of the two, the governor and the tax collector, the Sarraf Bashi, was actually appointed by the Sultan. Governors came in, governors went. Some governors were very good, others were very corrupt. And as it happened, in 1820s, at the end of 20s, a corrupt governor arrived in Baghdad. The father of the founder of this dynasty, the father of David Sassoon, was a Sarraf Bashi for more than 20 years. That gave him also the position of Nasi, the president of the community of Baghdad. But the governor arrived, he was very corrupt, and his way of embezzling money from different families, well-off families in the province, was to actually arrest a member of a family, ask for a ransom. If they paid, the family member would be released. If not, would linger in the prison. So David Sassoon actually was arrested. The father paid the ransom, but realized that this game is going to keep going on. And so he told him to leave Baghdad. And the night he was released, he fled to Basra, from Basra to Bushir in southern Persia at the time. Father joined him later on, but a very important point, the siblings of David Sassoon all stayed behind. David at the time had a young family of his first wife, who died at a very young age after the birth of the fourth child. They had two boys and two girls. He married a year later, and his new wife came with him, obviously, to Bushir. And there he settled, more or less trying to figure out where the next step. And that's in itself really fascinating. There were a lot of merchants at the time. Remember, this is an empire, so you're moving. Some went to Aleppo. From Aleppo, they came back. Some stayed in Iran, Persia at the time. Some went to the Gulf. You see families that are in what is now Bahrain or the equivalent of Kuwait, because it was open borders. Somehow he made the decision to go to Bombay. All we know that I found in the archives that he had already one meeting with the British consul in Baghdad, who at some point, it seems, served in India, and told him about the opportunities. And putting it together, it seems one of the real things that pushed him to go there is the fact that he heard in India no one care about religion or identity, and it's all about business. And so the father, actually, his father died in Bushir, and that gave him a little bit the flexibility to take his young family of two boys, two girls, with his wife, new wife, and go to Bombay. Bombay was really an interesting place, but nothing to write home about. It had only a population of 200,000 people. You know, remember today is more than 27 million, but very cosmopolitan. There were Muslims, Christians, Jews going back. There were also what they called the native Jews, the Bnei Israel, and Parsis, and different. And there was really an atmosphere of being a cosmopolitan city. This is the founder, and he actually stayed with that formal dress throughout the whole time that he lived in India, where he spent the rest of his life in India. From the beginning, even before he began the business, David made the decision to identify with the British colonial power. You have to remember, we're talking about 1830, 1832. There is only one superpower in the world. and that superpower was gaining more strength at the time. So he made an early decision to identify totally and utterly with the British Empire and informed everyone he is willing to serve its interest throughout the British Empire. And what is interesting, that in 1853, he was granted British citizenship. He neither set foot in Britain, nor he spoke in English. In fact, this document in the archives, it's signed in Hebrew because he didn't know how to sign his name in English. He spoke Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and learned Hindustani upon arrival, but did not learn English. And later on in life, the Arabic language was very, very important for him. He, and later on his oldest son, beat the message time and again. Arabic, 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 and the connection to the homeland was very important, and I'll come back to that. One of the interesting things, of course, that David Sassoon never could comprehend is the fact that he had to swear allegiance to a corporation in addition to a sovereign. I mean, that really, especially coming from the Ottoman Empire, seemed the most bizarre thing. But as we all know, East India Company controlled India until 1857. The reason for the identification with the British Empire is actually really, as I said, very easy to understand. You're arriving as a refugee, you want to be accepted in India. They are the most important superpower at the time and the colonial power in India. It seemed a very natural aspect to do. I actually was not interested in writing the history of the Sassoon, and I tell the story in the preface of the book. But there was something that I discovered as I became interested, and that is in finding thousands and thousands of these archives, which are basically the business correspondence of the family over 100 years. Given that we are here at the Institute for the Study of Iraq, I thought I'll just read you a little bit of this so you get the feeling. So this is a combination of 3 languages. This is Baghdadi Jewish dialect. It's in Arabic, but written in Hebrew letters. If you cannot read all 3, you cannot decode it. Okay, let me just read you so you think. You will see in this, what I'm reading you, there is a little bit of Hebrew, there is a little bit of everything. أحدثوا بعد يا أخي تعلم كل الخير سابق من سنغافور حررتوا لك الإيدك بالخير ومن بعد من بنانغ هم كان بخاطري أكتب لك ولكن ما صار فرصة وبعزغات الشام يوم بيت 10 فبراير وصلنا إلى كلكتة بالسلامة والراف إليا جاي يتلقانا من المركب دخان ونزلنا عنده يوم ثالث ووصل عنا عبد الله لهالطرف ونحن رحنا إلى بردوان ضرب 70 مايل نتلقى منه وبكلكتة كثير بالليل عال ولكن جيتنا صارت قليل بطيء and so on and so forth. It is really remarkable. Oops. One of the things that you really realize that there are no paragraphs there, which made it extremely, extremely difficult to decipher because it jumped from one subject to another. There is no rhyme or reason. It begins always very formal, it ends very formal, but it jumps from one subject to another. But it became really discovering the hidden history. I mean, tens of thousands of these documents are at the National Library, including all their trading ledger books, which was incredible to try to recreate this history of the family. One of the most interesting aspects in discovering this history is the fact that previous books on the Sassoon barely mentioned her, and if they mentioned her, they mentioned she was a good hostess. But actually, I discovered that for 6 years, she was the only CEO of a global trading firm in the world in the 19th century. There were a lot of matriarchs all around the world, all the different cultures, but not a proper CEO who run the business day in, day out from 1895 to 1901. And you will be surprised and shocked how sophisticated the business became then, including currency arbitrage, arbitrage between Mexican silver and Chinese silver. And this woman run the whole business from Bombay. And actually in the book, a whole chapter is dedicated to her and all the story around her. And I'm happy to answer any questions. There are many characters in the book, but these are the main ones. David Sassoon, the founder that I spoke to, the oldest son, Abdullah, that notice the change, all of them without exceptions, anglicized their names, followed by Elias, then Flora that I just mentioned, Farha, who anglicized her name to Flora, and finally the last kind icon is Victor Sassoon. There are many others. There is, of course, Sir Philip Sassoon, an art connoisseur, head of the National Gallery, deputy secretary for the Air Force in the 1920s. There is, of course, the famous poet of World War I, Siegfried Sassoon. And then, of course, there are many others, but these are the important ones. David Sassoon insisted, first of all, one of the things that really shook me, how young these boys were sent to work and to travel. It's absolutely shocking, 18, 19, 20. And of course, there is no correspondence back home. I mean, because every letter took 3 to 5 weeks, so you couldn't call mama or daddy and check with them. And it was horrendous conditions, considering some of these people went in such remote places. From his second wife, he had 10 children who survived. Remember what the percentage of death of a childbirth or of mothers at the time. So we know 10 survived. So 10 from the second wife, 4 from the first wife. I call them the small army of the Sassoons, which he really utilized in spreading them around in a very effective way. They all were trained at a very young age, usually 16. They were sent back to Baghdad for many reasons. One, they must learn the language, because remember, you just saw the thing. Only in Baghdad you could write that language. So he kept going back to Baghdad. Two, from a religious point of view, they felt that the only center for their religion is Baghdad. And homeland, Baghdad as a homeland was really a very, very important motive throughout the first and second generation of the Sassoons. What is really interesting, David Sassoon never had any knowledge of how to trade. His father was not a trader. As I mentioned, he was a tax collector. He was the president of the community. But they had 2 important aspects, 2 distinct advantages. One, phenomenal relationships throughout the Ottoman Empire and Persia. And two, a really, really very high caliber reputation of the family. And I will come back to this issue of trust that prevailed in the 19th century and its importance. No event or trade changed the destiny. It was really step by step, stone by stone. He was a great learner. He, for example, started going to the cotton exchange in Bombay and just sat there listening, learning. He figured out at a very early stage that actually a bad harvest in the US in the 1850s increased the prices of cotton globally. He entered the cotton market. We're talking about such a small amount. In the archives, actually, or the local newspaper, he's not even mentioned in the 1830s because he was totally insignificant from a merchant point of view. And to me, that is even more interesting. The fact he didn't do one trade that made him or one investment that changed. It was literally step by step building an empire. Two things he learned from a very early stage, their importance. Two things that are critical even in today's business. One is networks and two is information. He realized without reliable information, you can't do anything, you can't make the right decisions. And two, to get the right information, you need to have the right contacts who are trustworthy, who are willing to tell you and give you the correct information. And of course, because of his family members, because of these children and sons-in-law, he had an incredible way of spreading that network and gaining information. He was the first among all merchant families in India to send a son to England in the 1850s. Other families told him, why would you send your son? You're not going to see him that often. Well, they didn't see the others who went into China or other places that often. But he believed at a very early stage that London is the financial center of the world and you need to have someone there. This becomes such a critical point because, believe it or not, being in London at the time, even as a small merchant family, you had better information when the American Civil War erupted in 1861. And what happened during that war is typical of how the networks and the information was categorically critical. First 2 years of the war, cotton prices quadrupled. There were rumors at the time that people were tearing their mattresses and selling the cotton. The last 2 years of the war, Brazil entered the market, Egypt entered the market, India started producing more, prices collapsed. By 1865, when the war ended, 82% of all traders in Bombay filed bankruptcy. That opened huge opportunities. He was among the first to send a son to China because of opportunities. Once the first Opium War ended, China was opened to foreigners and opium became a legal commodity to trade. So what is amazing is that this is within 25, 30 years after his arrival. Look at all these hubs that they established and ports that they were part of. 3 red stars, these are the main hubs. The first one was Bombay, the second one was Shanghai, and by the 1860s, early 1870s, London. And all the others are port cities, but it was very, very critical to have that kind of spread around the world. In fact, one competitor put it by the early 1860s, and let me quote, "Silver and gold, silks, gums and spices, opium and cotton, wool and wheat, whatever moves over sea or land, feels the hands or bears the mark of Sassoon and Co." And that really tells you this story. One of the most fascinating things discovering in the trade ledgers of the family is the fact that they came up with a very innovative aspect of charity. Most business people then and now, if they have a good year, they give X. If they have not so good year, maybe half an X. The Sassoons did it in a very interesting way. They imposed on themselves a charity tax. So you look at the ledger, and the first item, let's say a chest of tea, cost, maritime insurance, cost, expenses of shipping, cost, and always, the last item is 0.25% tzedakah tax, charity. Now, you could argue a quarter of 1% is nothing. Yes, it is nothing. But if you're doing hundreds and even thousands of trade, irrelevant of whether the trade is profitable or not, huge amount accumulated at the end of the year. And that was spent on charity. The charity on wherever they worked and wherever they lived, and that was the basis. They did not just give money everywhere. That was kind essential that it has to be in the places they worked. Some went to the Jewish causes or the Jewish communities. These two synagogues, the one on the left, the Magen David, it's actually a functioning synagogue. It's beautiful in Bombay, that was refurbished by the Indian government back in the early 2000s. The last few years of David's life, he moved to Pune, which is about today 4 or 5 hours by car. Has a little bit better weather in the sense of less humidity. And there he built this synagogue, which is still incredible because you can see it from almost anywhere in Pune. And he is buried in the grounds of that synagogue. But it was not only to synagogue and Jewish center. He built the library. Any one of you who go today to Mumbai, this is in the heart of the city. It's a functioning library. It started as an institute for reform to help juvenile. Then it became and developed. And actually, until the 1930s, there was a Sassoon. And at the left, you could see his statue adorns the entrance to the, and this one I took just a few years ago, just the year before COVID. 1864, David Sassoon died. David left a very clear will. Abdullah, my oldest son, shall be the next president, boss of the company. The second son, Elias, that I showed you his picture at the beginning, said, wait a second, this is not acceptable. I have been in China for the last 5, 6 years. I went all over. I set up all the business. I brought more profits in the last, whatever, 5, 6 years. I think a fair allocation is 50-50 between you and me, to Abdullah. In the archives, there is this incredible correspondence through representatives, through lawyers. trying to figure out a way to come to terms. There is no agreement. And so in 1867, the firm split. And from that point of view, we have two entities, David Sassoon and Co., E.D. Sassoon and Co., E.D. being alias David Sassoon. It was very confusing. Clients began to complain. The Chinese had a wonderful way of dealing with it. The David Sassoon, they called the old Sassoon, the E.D. Sassoon, they called the new Sassoon, in order to distinguish who is who. The two brothers never spoke again to their death. The competition between the two was horrendous, fierce. On certain level, it forced both of them to be more innovative, more creative in business. For example, Abdullah went into purchasing after the opening of the Suez Canal, bought a huge piece of land and turned it into docklands. And if you go today and ask any taxi driver in Mumbai and say, take me to the Sassoon docks, it is there. This really was very, very important point in the history of the family. And I argue in the book that probably was one of the main reasons for the demise. Here, these two great business people, innovative, interesting, and yet they clash with each other. Abdullah becomes the head of that family. But anyway, if you recall, I mentioned one of the brothers was sent to London. Another brother went, and another sister went, and another brother went. And Abdullah was getting itchy. He was getting those letters about how life is amazing in London or somewhere else, or their travels in Europe, and he's stuck there. Sometimes it's monsoon, and sometimes it's the heat, and sometimes it's the humidity. But even before a decision was made to move to England, he was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1872. He changed his name, and from that point on, he was known as Sir Albert. That kind pushed him one final step to moving. So the next year, he moved to England, settled in London, and later in that year, Sir Albert was presented with another honor at a large gathering at the Guildhall in London. As the presentation brochure stated, and I am quoting, "This is the first time an East Indian merchant has been admitted to the honor highly prized by its possessor and much coveted by the aspirants to city fame. It is the first that the freedom of the city of London has been presented to a Jew." I mean, it was really a tremendous honor. Think about it. 40 years before that, the family left with nothing. The father of Albert left with nothing, goes to Bushire, moves to Bombay, and here he is, Sir Albert, and is coveted by this incredible honor at the heart of the city of London, which by definition was the capital of the financial system. This was really almost, if you want to think about it, the beginning of the end, because that move changed everything. The emphasis now was no longer on India. Only one brother, Suleiman, and his wife, Flora. Flora is Sassoon's, she is a Sassoon and married a Sassoon on both sides. That was the only real people. Elias stayed in India and kept developing the business in China. But the David Sassoon crowd moved to England, and that was the focus. One of the fascinating things that I discovered in 100 years of archives, not once there was a question asked or raised, should we deal with A or not deal with A because of religion or nationality or whoever? Absolutely not. They had friends everywhere. The issue was always, can you trust your counterpart? That was the real thing, irrelevant of anything. An emblem was created after the death of David Sassoon. You could see Emet ve'Emunah, Candide Constante, emphasizing the importance of the trust. There is the palm tree to remind them of their home. There are some religious symbols in there. Now, as they moved to England, began a new aspect. Marriages, the first generation married only with Baghdadis. In fact, if they could not find a partner, a spouse in India, they would send for someone to figure out who should be from Baghdad, and that's the way it was done. The second generation began to get married into wealthy, aristocratic, Jewish European families. Let me read you one small thing from the book. Albert's son, Abdullah's son, second son, Edward, married Aline Caroline, daughter of Baron Gustave de Rothschild of Paris, on 19th of October, 1887. Let me read you what the newspapers at the time wrote. The Grand Rabbi of France conducted the ceremony to a packed synagogue on Rue de la Victoire. The flowers, the singing, the jewels, the presents, the oratory, the titles, the aroma of wealth took away the breath of plebeian spectators, completely overpowered by the magnificence of the fete. Of course, at the reception, just the 1,200 people were invited and entertained by the chorus of the Paris Opera. And the groom gave the bride a pearl necklace costing about 9,000 pounds. Then it's about 1 million pounds. That tells you something. And Aline became very important in British society. She was very charming, had incredible places. And there was two families in St. Petersburg, Trieste in Italy, and on, and they're all huge marriages, huge importance. That is next part. Of course, now the aspirations is higher and higher. It actually begins the aspiration to be part of the upper class, the aristocracy. Back in India, when the Prince of Wales visited Bombay, he was entertained by the Sassoons. And a real link was created. And when they moved to London, that relationship continued to strengthen. In fact, there were a few years, you know, all these the royal palaces keep track of who goes in and who goes out. One of the Sassoon was the second person who entered a couple of years more than anyone else into the royal palaces. So once you are there, there must be, you have to be in that game, you have to have a huge houses, huge estates. I want to read you a little piece. All of Albert's surviving brothers, except Suleiman, were by now resident in London. Arthur lived on Albert Gate near Hyde Park. He was believed to have one of the best music rooms in any home in London and one of the city's finest staircases. Frederick, notice all the names now has been changed. He was Chaim. Frederick the youngest lives in Knightsbridge. Reuben, meanwhile, had settled at 1 Belgrave Square, amusingly described as one of England's 12 most beautiful houses, as modern, quote, with very little Oriental about it, end of quote. In fact, many of its rooms were garnished with Chinese and Japanese embroideries. But here comes the most interesting thing. Unusually for the time, the house had 3 lifts, one for dinner, another for domestic staff, and one to connect the stable with the street outside. It was seen as one of the most technically advanced homes in London. Numerous bathrooms had showers, and the lift in the stables had been installed so that horses could be housed above ground level to benefit from natural light. There were reportedly, quote, so many ingenious mechanical arrangements in Mr. Sassoon's house that an engineer is in residence to answer for their perfect working order. And that began to tell you the story of where the money went. Houses like this. Now you're in the upper class. What do? You have to be in shooting, hunting estates. And this is some of the houses that they lived in. They always had huge houses. The one at the bottom to the left is Sanssouci, is the first house that David Sassoon bought in Bombay. It is today the Messina Hospital, which is huge, but again, entertainment at the level of hundreds and hundreds of people. You could see the house in Pune, which is connected today because he built the hospital there. And actually today it's still called the Sassoon Hospital, and they took over that house. And then some of the houses in England and in the countryside. To me, one of the pictures that really said everything to me is this picture in the sense of sitting in an estate in Scotland. It's now about shooting. It's now about hunting, about fishing. I found a wonderful letter from a member of the family. It says, we went this morning to the office at 11 a.m. At 1, we went to club for lunch, and at 3 p.m., we headed to the horse racing to bet on horses. And I thought, wow, if David Sassoon or Albert Sassoon, who worked 6 days a week, 14 hours, had figured out that members of the family are going to work 2 hours and then go and bet horses, that tells you something. And in the book, I argue that the demise of the David Sassoon is actually once they pushed out Flora Sassoon out of power, that the real decline began. The other family was luckier. The other part of the family, Elias Sassoon, was luckier. Victor Sassoon, that I showed you his picture, decided to move the business in the 1920s from India to China. There were no more commodity tradings. It all focused on real estate. He built the first skyscraper in Shanghai, bringing a big firm from Manhattan that specialized in building on the same kind of land, reclaimed land, and he built the skyscraper. You see the one on the left, how it looked in the 1930s. To the right, a recent picture, which is still a 5-star hotel. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. But 1949 came, and the Sassoons lost 17 buildings. They had, for example, Victor Sassoon was the first to introduce the idea of service apartments. Remember, Shanghai was a hub for business people, for famous people. It was the place you have to go if you were anyone. And some of these people, and he was a playboy. Marlene Dietrich is rumored to be one of his girlfriends. All the Hollywood star, you could see Charlie Chaplin with him there. I think it was really important. He took a huge amount of money, he built an empire, but what he did not anticipate, a Japanese invasion in 1937, followed by World War II, followed by a civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and a total, utter nationalization. And so that part of the family also ended. He actually left broken man, and he was not very healthy because he had a crash as a pilot in World War I, and he always suffered with his leg and back. Married his nurse in New York, who was about 35 years younger, died in the Bahamas, and that more or less came the end of that side of the family. I want to read you one last paragraph before ending. The arc from unassuming beginnings to spectacular success and ignoble end took the two Sassoon companies less than a century and a half to traverse. The sheer rapidity of the opening and closing act draws the obvious question. Why? Why did they thrive where so many other trading families merely subsided or even failed? And having reached the heights that they did, what went wrong? Well, for that, you need to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that brilliant lecture. If that doesn't make you want to go out and buy the book, nothing will. But I think we have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you so that our audience viewing us remotely will be able to hear the question. But Joan, please.
I'm cheating with two questions. One is, who gave the archive to the National Archive? Who deposited it? And secondly, in your 100-year of archives, when did they stop using the Baghdadi Jewish Arabic dialect in their code?
It's interesting. By the end of the 19th century, social news were in English. So sometimes you see letters half English. So if it's about a marriage or something, it was in English. The level of Arabic was obviously deteriorating. There are many letters by Albert and then Elias berating members of the family. Abdullah was very, very angry that people in the Hong Kong office did not know Arabic well, and that basically they thought it was unacceptable, but that's the change that was taking place. By the end of World War I, it really almost declined. Some of the old ones kept writing a business thing in that Baghdadi Jewish dialect language. The rest started moving. So, for example, all the archives of Victor Sassoon, without exception, are all in English. There is not a clear answer for the first question. Here is my guess. One of the grandchild or great-grandchild of Flora Sassoon was the first to move to Israel in 1970s. He was a rabbi, and he collected these things, and I assume it's reached a point where, I mean, we're talking literally 100 large boxes. They're not properly handled. I mean, because they never had any request or demand for it. I mean, they have on the plan to digitize it, but since not many can use it, they're putting their resources somewhere else. I'm hoping, I saw in one of the newspapers that they moved to a beautiful new building now, so I don't know, maybe that will push, but these papers are in a dire state. I mean, any archivist would be frightened to see what's happening to them. Yes.
Thank you for a brilliant lecture, as Paul has said. I was just wondering in Bombay what the relationship was between David Sassoon and the Gigi boys.
And
the Parsis, in particular, the Gigi boy who was allegedly the richest man in the British Empire, but perhaps David Sassoon was.
No, Gigi boy was much at level, at certain time, definitely the richest man. You bring a very interesting point. I think one of the fascinating aspects, this competition between all those people existed, and yet they were really behaved in a gentleman way. One of the people that the Sassoons were very close to is the Tatas, the owners of Jaguar and Land Rover. And for a long period there, so on any Sassoon company or board, there were like two Tatas. On any companies of the Tatas, there were two. And I talk about it in the book because there is a fascinating lesson there for business people. People say it's about luck. It is about luck. But then there were 1,000 people who were there, why some people have succeeded and others. In the 1870s, late 1870s, Tata goes to the Sassoons and say, this commodity business is going to come to an end. We got to get out. They were all in opium, in cotton, in tea, in silk, the same thing. Let's move. There is an industrial revolution going on in Europe. Let's move to industry. They laughed at him, basically. They told him, look, it's clinking money, who cares? He says, no, but I'm talking about. And there was a point where this beginning the demise of the Sassoon. And I found that Tata took himself and went and spent 4.5 months in Pittsburgh in the United States to learn about the steel business, then took it back to India. Well, the difference is the Tatas are still there and have an empire. Yes.
Sorry, I was interested just to learn a little bit more about the split between the two brothers and what the fundamental reasons were, and also was Elias more successful than Abdullah, or the other? Sorry, the other thing was also I was wondering towards the end of the time in Shanghai, where the family business was established in so many places, including Hong Kong, and I wondered why they didn't move to Hong Kong in the way the Kaduris did, for example.
Well, that's an excellent question. And I talk about that. I mean, it's really interesting. And that goes back to the previous point about the Tatas. Victor had a lot of contacts in Hong Kong. And the Kaduri, he managed to escape out of Shanghai just before the final occupation. And went all over from 41 to the end of the war, going around giving speeches everywhere in the States, in Europe, about the world. By the way, most of his speeches were so wrong. He expected Japan never to invade America. He says they would never do it. He said if the communists came up, they're going to keep all the foreigners because they need every major, you know, of those decisions was wrong. But here is the interesting thing. The Kaduris did not manage to get out. They were interned for 3 years and, like the Sassoons, lost everything. But they started, and he had contact. There was a very interesting correspondent. His first cousin, Victor's first cousin, was his right man, his foreign currency guru, told him, look, let's build in Hong Kong. We have all the resources. We have all the contacts. Nope, I want to get out, and sold literally for cents to the dollar, got out and went to the Bahamas. And of course, the Kaduris built in everything from the beginning. They also, as I said, lost everything. But at least the Sassoons, that part of the Sassoon, the Edie Sassoon, had this thing going on until the 49s. The ones of Abdullah Alberts, it ended up, once they pushed Flora out of power, it really, there was no other leader. And I'll give you one example. Sir Philip Sassoon, member of parliament, deputy, and involved with the National Gallery, was also technically the chairman of David Sassoon & Co. For 13 years of his chairmanship, I did not find one business letter because he was not interested in business. It was collecting a rent. That's how they saw it. So when he died, for the first time, they brought someone from the outside, and he was paralyzed. And so that part of the business died a natural death because no one anymore was interested. And there was really no innovation. Once the commodity business all died, I mean, opium came to a natural death with World War I, and then all the others, the trading in textiles, in cotton, you know, you had now Japan and then China and all this enter the market, and they were totally out of it. And so nothing was left.
But if there are no more questions for the moment, there will be a reception to follow, and there'll be plenty of opportunity where Professor Sassoon can be inundated with questions. But for this evening's event, we're very grateful indeed that it's been supported by Dango Education. And I'd like to invite at this moment David Dango to say a few words.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Professor Sassoon, for enlightening us about this special period in Iraqi Jewish history. When I mention that I am a Jewish person who grew up in Baghdad, people here say, Jews in Iraq? Impossible. And I'm very happy that in your own way as well, by writing about the Sassoons, you still make that point that Jews had quite a role to play in Iraq for quite a long time in the recent past. So thank you for the lecture. And also I want to take the opportunity to thank BC, the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, for hosting the lecture. I first became a supporter of some of BC's works in 2017, about 6 years ago, because I really felt that if you want to know Iraq, you need to know BC. When I arrived in this country around 1960, I was asked, where do you come from? And I'd say Iraq, and they'd say, Persia. Of course, no one had heard of Iraq. They thought I meant Iran. Today, when I mention Iraq, people say, well, it's all blood and intrigue and Saddam Hussein. But of course, that area, Mesopotamia, has a long and quite a lot of distinguished history, which BC is helping to keep alive in our memory today. They focused on archaeology. The original concept was from Gertrude Bell, and they're now in their 91st year, I think. And they draw attention to the very rich history and archaeology and cultures that went through that part of the world. And therefore, I think if you have any feeling for Iraq and its history, become at least a subscriber to their mailing list and perhaps support it in a little way. For many people who've had some involvement with Iraq somehow through family or being there for work or whatever, it's at least a more peaceful way of interacting with Iraq. We sadly today in the Middle East, it's all about the kind of things that do not reflect Iraqi history. So I want to repeat my gratitude to BC for putting on this lecture, but also for all they do for keeping alive the civilizations that existed in Iraq. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed. That was a wonderful talk, and I'd now like to invite someone who's had a long association with BC, Mrs. Joan Mortimer-Keever, to give a vote of thanks.
Well, I'm sure all of you are going to go and buy the book because you can do so outside. But weren't we treated to the most incredible lecture tonight and an insight that I think for many of us, we might have had quite a lot of knowledge about, but not as much as we perhaps should have. And the details of the archive are just overwhelming. I would like to thank not only the speaker, because of course it's wonderful that he came, but it was thanks to David that we actually have the speaker, because he actually asked us whether we might like to hold this event, and we said, yes, of course we would, and it is a total delight. This is the second time. Professor Sassoon was also very involved in our Jews of Iraq conference, which we've already talked about, and David also helped us on that as well as helping us on many other things. I thank you all for coming here, but I also thank those who are on Zoom who have attended this event, and I think there's quite a few of you. I would like to also say that we welcome you to a reception afterwards, and anybody who's not a member of BUSY, please do join us. And please join us, and thank you again. And I would like us to now clap and thank our wonderful speaker for this wonderful evening. And please enjoy the reception.